Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
How's everyone doing tonight? I just want to make sure off the bat that everybody can see my screen, because for some reason I sometimes forget to share it with you guys, and that makes the webinar less eventful if you can't see my screen. So I want to make sure that everybody can see me and see my screen, and that all of that is like it's supposed to be. So if someone could just enter something into the chat area to let me know, I would appreciate it. Okay. It appears that everybody can see my screen, so that's good news. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight on a Tuesday night at 7 o'clock Central Time where I am. So, hopefully it's not too late wherever you are. Tonight's webinar is about the use pretty much of texting language in the classroom. I teach a lot of the communication classes for the Art Institute. I have been doing it, I think, for 5 years now, 5, 6 years, something like that. And you can readily see the decline of proper English in the classroom. And you can see it kind of go to more of, sometimes students will kind of get carried away with their enthusiasm, and it turns more into a chat room rather than a formal classroom. And I see it more so in my email communication with my students as well. And that's kind of where this idea generated, is how to, kind of look at the trend and see where it's headed, but also to see ways that we can combat it and hopefully try to steer students into the right direction. Because, and I'll get into more of this as the presentation goes on, at the end of the day, we're training these students for the real world, and how you would communicate in a chat room or through text messaging is not something that would be necessarily tolerated in the workplace, obviously depending on where you worked. But, in a general corporate business setting, that's something that you wouldn't normally see. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, pretty much, sorry, hang on a second. I was trying to hide you guys so I could see my presentation. And I think online and on-ground teachers have the same issue going on. I don't think it's just to online teachers specifically where we're seeing the increase in texting language and less formal communication in the classroom. It kind of, like, I have a little joke here, and it says that, we find ourselves asking students, are you too busy to write, or are you too lazy? And that's kind of the way we've started to see communication start to go in the classroom setting. Proper spelling and grammar rules have become increasingly harder to maintain in the classroom. And so it's caused me to kind of sometimes have to go back to the basics with my students and kind of remind them about the setting that we're in and what's expected of them. And so today, like I said, we'll talk about, how to deal with this trend when faced with difficulties. I think the big question we need to ask ourselves is anyone actually talk anymore? I find myself using, me talking on the phone less and less as the years have gone on. The only people I really talk to on the phone that much anymore are maybe business calls, or maybe older members of my family who that's all they know how to do is talk on the phone. But I know with like friends and, younger family members, I don't find myself actually talking on the phone with them that much. Just more so because I find that it's sometimes, if I want to meet, if you want to meet someone for dinner, it's just easier to shoot them a text and say, what time are we meeting for dinner? And they'll respond back and say 6:30. Whereas, you're picking up the phone, calling them. If they can't answer the phone at the time because they're in a meeting or what have you, you have to wait for them to return your call. So sometimes it's just more of a convenience issue, while we find ourselves actually not talking as much anymore. But as the infographic here says, 64% of teens admit to using text speak in their classroom writing assignments. Plus, 25% have said they have used emoticons, and 38% have used abbreviations like laugh out loud. And so as a teacher, even though it's talking about teenagers, you have to think that soon these teenagers will actually become college students. And so for them to freely admit that they have used abbreviations such as LOL in their formal essays that they're turning in their writing classes and English classes, that to me is a somewhat scary trend. And why does all of this matter? Communicating poorly may give students the wrong impression of you. The person may think you can't think clearly, express yourself well, spell, or be able to put together a well-formed sentence. I tell my communication students all the time that it doesn't matter, how smart you are or how creative you are or how many great ideas you have. If you can't properly communicate those either orally or in writing in a way that is clear and concise and really sells yourself well, it's going to make it to where you're that much at a disadvantage to likely get the job that you want to be interviewed for and you want to hopefully get one day. And so that's something I really try to really drive home with my communication students, because they give speeches in their classes and a lot of them are intimidated by the speech making process. And I tell them at the end of the day, we're just simply communicating and you're not actually having to get up and give these, moving presidential type speeches. And the way we look at communication, it's more about just being able to effectively communicate. And I think that's kind of what everything needs to kind of tie back into as far as does anyone actually talk anymore. And there's even become a national championship for texting. I couldn't find the newest figures on this, but in 2012, it was won by a 17-year-old, and he texted 149 words in 39 seconds without any errors. So again, like I've said, you can see that this is kind of the trend of not just, communication, but our just society in general, that we're moving more to a less verbal society. And I think if we don't kind of be careful with that, we may lose the ability to actually communicate verbally. So, feel free to add your own 2 cents in here, obviously, but these are just some of the examples that I have seen in my classroom or in my email from students. And, kind of despite our best efforts, no matter what we do to try to say that these things aren't acceptable, I still see them on a discussion thread or in a student email. And some of them, some of these are kind of humorous and some of these are just kind of, just here or there. But, the one I see a lot is OMG, I totally agree with your answer. Emails, I see things like sorry, except they abbreviate it SRY. I haven't been, and then they'll not spell been correctly. In class, late instead of lately, had flu. And so you'll see where they'll just kind of send out a quick little message and not really think about the sentence they're actually trying to formulate. And then, could you tell me where to find assignment? The one that really gets me is when they abbreviate assignment to just ASS, and that really bothers me to no end. And then FYI, I had to work late last night, so paper is late. And then, in my humble opinion, you graded my paper too harsh. And then the one that I see a lot is the smiley face. In the student thread, it doesn't automatically change it to a smiley face, but PowerPoint automatically changed it for me. But I see the smiley face a lot. Some of you might be okay with that. You may think that it creates a friendly environment. And the smiley face doesn't really bother me as much as other ones do as far as using abbreviations and that sort of thing. But again, I just try to steer them back to formal communication so that way it's an easy transition from being in the online classroom to hopefully being in the workplace. So where did all of this LOL and OMG and all that kind of stuff originate? Well, now those are legitimate words in the Oxford English Dictionary. And so you have to imagine that our students are saying, well, if the Oxford English Dictionary says that it's okay, then why can't we use that in the classroom? And again, I think that ties back into trying to prepare our students for the next level. I thought whenever I was sitting down to do my research for this webinar, I started to kind of look into some of these acronyms and abbreviations to see where they originated. And some of these were even used long before the internet and being online was as popular as it is today. It says that NetSpeak historian Ben Zimmer told PC World that the first documentation documented mention of LOL comes from a May 1989 newsletter called Fido News. And even more interesting was the information I found over OMG. It says it dates back to 1917 when 75-year-old John Fisher, first Baron, he sent a letter to Winston Churchill that concluded, "I hear a new order of knighthood is on the taps. OMG, meaning please, knight me, please." And so, I'm so sorry. My dog has a squeaky toy, and he's being extremely loud with it. I apologize. So you can see here that what we might have thought would be new language, shockingly, some of this goes back to 1917. But does the fact that it goes back to 1917 make it okay? That's kind of what we're talking about tonight. I believe it's highly debatable. I believe it's a matter of, a lot of it has to go into your teaching style, your teaching preference. But I also think it's one of those things where if you allow students a little bit of freedom with using acronyms and texting language, you have to be careful that they don't take that even further to where we're missing the whole purpose of proper English. So, is texting language the downfall of the English language? Based upon the research I found, it said that 97% of young adults who own a cell phone text on a daily basis. Not really a big shocker there if you are around teenagers, have a teenager, probably yourself. If you text a lot, it's not, probably unheard of that they are on the phone constantly, always texting. Young adults in an average of 109.5 text messages a day. I don't know what that would work into. I should have done the math before the webinar as far as, hours in a day to text messages. But to me, I kind of felt like that was a lot of text messages in one day. Maybe that's just me, but I don't know. So again, it's no surprise that texting slang has found its way into the classroom. And in 2011 article that was published in the U.S. News, professor of race relations at the University of Pennsylvania stated that admissions officers have shared with me that a lot of essays they're encountering are now deeply rooted in this technological culture of cut-off sentences where you're writing like you speak. After the first few sentences, college admissions professionals toss them to the side. So if you think about it in those terms, you can already see that using text messaging language in place of proper English and formal communication, even at the high school level, can affect your future if you aren't careful in these situations in which you use it. If you use texting language or, poorly abbreviated words in a college admissions essay, that could really hinder, your future and what your outlook's going to be like if you aren't able to get into the college of your choice. So you can kind of see how, the habits that you form maybe around 15 or 16 or so, if you don't have certain things in place to kind of help hold those back a little bit, they can kind of take over and move on to the college level or maybe hold you back from, taking the college route that you wanted to take. And then I found even more further research. According to a Pew report from 2011, teenage and young adult job applicants are having trouble separating texting language from proper English. Companies that hire 18 to 22-year-olds are finding job applicants with phrases such as, "I want to be a counselor because I love to work with kids." And the problem, obviously, with that sentence is the fact that the I isn't capitalized. I don't know about you. I'm not sure what subjects everybody teaches, but I find that to be one of the biggest mistakes, not even texting language, but just as far as, using the English language, is capitalizing the I when it stands alone. And I don't know if that's just because they're not used to doing it, again, when they're communicating with their peers and they get to typing their responses and typing their sentences, and they just get out of the habit of, capitalizing the I whenever they're in the classroom because they're not used to doing it outside of the classroom, or if it's just a matter of being lazy. I'm not really sure which is the case, but I always, try to point that out to my students because particularly for me, the way I feel is at the college level, we for sure should not be seeing it to where the I is not capitalized. To me, that kind of goes back to basic English, when you learn in elementary school. Again, that's just my opinion, but that seems to be the number one thing that I find with my students. And then English instructor Cindy Glover said, spent a lot of time unteaching internet speak. My students were trying to communicate fairly academic, scholarly thoughts, but some of them didn't seem to know it's you and not you. I see, the standalone you a lot too, just the same as I see the lowercase I. It tends to be another common mistake. And I kind of put on here, this should be a huge warning sign to us all that if you kind of don't stop these habits before they start, sometimes, they can tend to become solidified habits, for lack of a better word, that they're harder to undevelop and get students out of those habits if they're not pointed out early on and kind of indoctrinated to them that this is something that's not acceptable and something that you should probably get out of a habit of doing. So what can we do? Jeff Gabriel, a writing professor at Michigan State University, and his colleagues just released a study. And basically in this study, they took a look at first-year college students who were in writing classes just to kind of see how texting language was affecting, or how text messaging in general, not so much text messaging by itself, but, chatting in a chat room. And then a lot of people these days, I don't play video games. I don't even own a video game console. But apparently if you play Xbox or PlayStation or what have you, that's also something that you can do. You can play the game and chat at the same time, or maybe it's only video on a computer. I'm not real sure because I'm not into any of that stuff. But the point is they kind of looked at everything, like being in a chat room and chatting while you're playing a video game, and also text messaging. They looked at everything, and it said out of 1,366 students enrolled in a first-year writing class, 46% said that texting was the kind of writing that they performed more than any other. So I think what we can take away from that statement is the fact that I do believe that the younger generation is writing more these days than any generation ever has, because we're sending emails, we're doing text messages, we're in chat rooms. That's what our students are doing more so than any other generation ever. The problem with that is the fact that it's not necessarily formal, well thought out writing that needs to be seen in the classroom. And I think that is where the problem lies, is that it's hard for students to make that transition from being in the chat room and this kind of language is acceptable versus, being in being in the chat room and it's okay that I'm talking this way with my friend, but when I get to the classroom, I need to really, think about what I'm going to say, have well defined ideas. The problem also with not being mindful of what you're saying and how you're saying it in the classroom is, we've probably all experienced before, is if you're not clear in what you're saying and maybe you use acronyms that maybe other people don't understand, it creates a huge ground for miscommunication. Because I've seen it before. One student, will read a comment from another student and not think a thing about it, but then you'll have another student come along, especially maybe sometimes if there's a generation difference with the students in the class and they will not understand what the student is saying, might even mistake the student's tone and how they communicated their comments. If it was a deal where, maybe one student was asking the other student, could you clarify your idea more, or I didn't really understand what you were saying. But if that's somehow put into some sort of slang or texting language, and, there's that generation difference in the classroom, I have seen where that has kind of taken and gone to a whole new level. And, students are sending me emails outside of the classroom, wanting me to talk to another student because they weren't sure of that person's tone and they might have gotten offended by what they were saying. So that's the other problem with using non-formal communication in the classroom is that, like I said, it creates a huge ground for miscommunication. And that happens, of course, whenever you use proper English too. I mean, that's a really hard, bridge to make when you're communicating online. That's one of the things that I have found to be the downfall of online teaching is sometimes I would love to be able to stand in front of my students so they could hear my tone and hear what I mean, to make sure that, I'm wanting it to come across the way I mean. And sometimes that's just harder to do in the online environment. And it makes it even worse if we aren't communicating properly. So again, the professor that did this survey, he went on to note, we are in the midst of a massive change in our writing lives. Digital writing matters, and our challenge in education is to figure out how it matters in order to ensure that we can be useful to those interested in leveraging it. I think the big takeaway from that is, he's like, digital writing matters, and the challenge is to him, and the survey that he did, or the study that he did, is to figure out how we can take how students are wanting to maybe, text and be more digital in their note taking, especially if you're on campus teacher. If you're online, then it's kind of different. So some of this stuff may not be applicable to you, but I teach on campus too for a local school here. So I see a lot of stuff come in that way. But, it's to think about how we can use that to maybe utilize more learning techniques for students and not so much make it to where it's an absolute no, but to use it when appropriate. So what are some things that we can do to sort of combat this problem? I kind of feel this is one of those things where sometimes, despite our best efforts, and despite all of the announcements we put into class, and all of the things that we try to say and try to get across to students, and examples from maybe how using informal communication has affected how they're perceived in a job application, those sorts of things. Sometimes there's going to be some people that won't hear your message, and I think that's kind of the issue overall. But I think the things that we can do and we can be consistent about are keep reminding students of their future. And by that I mean keep reminding them that we are preparing them for the next level. And I know with the Art Institute, there's a lot of students that want to be photographers and digital artists and that sort of thing. And so, to them, probably being in the corporate world is not something that they ever see themselves being. However, you still have to be able to properly communicate with clients and with customers, and you need to be able to properly express those ideas either orally or in the written form, like I've said before. And so, again, I think it's important we keep reminding the students of their future. So that way they know that it may seem like we're being, a stickler or a stick in the mud about not using texting language in the classroom, but you have to think about how the skills that we're teaching them now are supposed to transition them to the next level. And if it's not okay, there, why should it be okay here? Whether we teach online or on ground, tell students that if they turn in papers written like instant messages, their grades will suffer. If a student doesn't see the consequences of their actions, then they're not going to know to change that behavior. You can verbally warn someone, and you can give them pointers and all that kind of stuff. But I think students really get the message if they start to see their GPA sort of drop a few points from not using proper English in the classroom. And again, we're training students for the real world where business presentations and proposals should be written in proper English. And again, I think the most important thing we can do is we also have to be the example and not fall back on bad habits ourselves. Sometimes it's real easy to, abbreviate what we want to say, or maybe throw in LOL if we think a student is funny. And again, I think that's kind of a personal preference. I know some instructors who do that, and I know some who don't. Granger. Sorry about that. I know some students who, throw in an LOL here. Instructors that throw in an LOL here and there. I think, again, it's a matter of preference. But whatever it is, if you're going to tell your students not to do it, obviously, you don't want to do it yourself. And I have a kind of thing that I do in my class where and some of you may think this is mean or harsh or sort of, but I always remind my students that if they do not email me with proper English and email me like they would if they were talking to me in a business setting, I may not know what they're talking about, and a lot of time can be wasted by me saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Granger, stop it. Granger. I apologize for that. So what was I saying? Okay. So, that if their students do not email me like they would in a business setting, and if I have to email them back and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you were asking, and then I have to wait for them, to respond back. If they're asking me a question about assignment that's due, that can really create some lag time, and it might even make it to where they might be turning the assignment in late, all because they didn't take the time to just spend that extra 30 seconds to write out a properly designed, well-worded email asking me a simple question such as, where can I find assignment 2? But when they go to abbreviated and all that kind of stuff, it can really create some lag time and make it to where it could take even longer for me to address their needs. Kind of seems like a far-fetched kind of example, or something that's may not be a real issue with you guys, but I find that it happens to me quite often. So, closing thoughts. Sometimes, like I said before, we just have to go back to the basics. We just have to go back to reminding students that this is a classroom and not a chat room, that certain types of language, and I mean, not even texting language, but off-color language or offensive language is just not something that needs to be used in this type of forum, because again, it is a classroom and not a chat room. Probably the most important thing that teachers can do is to emphasize to students the concept of audience. And by that, it's who are you addressing? Are you addressing a peer? Are you addressing a fellow student? Are you addressing me? Are you addressing maybe someone that you hope to be a future employer? That is what you always, we need to have our students keep in mind whenever it comes to trying to formulate their message in a formal way. Think about their audience. Students need to understand the importance of using the appropriate language in the appropriate setting, and that who one is writing for and how it affects in the way, affects the way in which one writes. Basically what all of that is saying is that, instant messaging and text messaging speak is perfectly acceptable with someone that maybe you're in a chat room with, or that's your peer, or that sort of thing, but is completely unacceptable when writing a formal letter, doing a job application, having a resume, those are cover letter, those kinds of things. I teach parts of that class too, and you would be amazed at some of the grammar and spelling mistakes I see due to just you can tell it's poor communication habits outside the classroom. They're not used to formally communicating, and so whenever you put them in that setting, sometimes it just throws them off balance. And when you go to read their cover letters, it kind of makes you see how far we have come in getting away from properly communicating and using proper English over probably the last 15 years, where text messaging has become a huge thing. At the end of the day, who knows? Given its roots in other languages, sometime soon we may be teaching I am speak as a legitimate form of language. But until then, until it becomes a deal where we are teaching that and wanting students to use that, again, I think it all kind of goes back to, like I've said throughout the whole presentation, is reminding students what we expect of them, setting the example for ourselves. That we're not going to use, slang or texting language in the classroom. And so if we're not going to use it, you as students should definitely not use it either. And also reminding them that we are training them for the next level, and that we're hoping to train them so that way they can secure future employment and are able to communicate in a business setting in a professional manner that, helps them communicate their ideas clearly and really makes it to where they're able to sell their abilities to that person that either hired them or that they're interviewing with. Any questions? Anything that maybe you have seen in your classroom that you have, maybe used to help other students, or problems you have seen, or maybe depending on what you teach, I guess this might be a bigger issue for some other than others. Like I said, I teach a lot of communication class, so obviously we have a lot of online discussion going on. So I see this kind of more maybe so than if you teach other areas outside of maybe the English communication setting. Any questions or comments? Okay, I see your comment, Sandra. You said the poor level of writing was a terrible problem in discussions, and discussions have been eliminated from math. Oh, see? Yeah. Yeah. So you can eliminate those from math classes, but it's really hard to eliminate them from communication classes. Yeah, I think I agree with you whenever you say, texting is not writing, especially for those that are coming out of high school and into the college level. I don't know what you have experienced, but I can tell you from my own personal level, I've only been out of high school, oh goodness, like 16, 17 years. But even back then, they weren't making it to where I felt like that I was ready for the next level. I didn't feel like once I got to college that the things that I did in high school prepared me, for college. And it was kind of a wake up call whenever I got to that first freshman English class. And so I agree with you there that maybe, a transitional writing class would be helpful to kind of help break new students of those poor habits, because I think we see it more and more in online classes simply because it's just so easy for them to treat it like a chat room when it's so much more than that, and it should be used as more of a formal setting. So I agree with your comment, and thank you for sharing it. So thank you for your attendance. Apparently all of the quizzes and assessments that help you earn credit for this class are on this Google site. It says, you go on this site and then you select a month of training, the far right column entitled assessment, and then click earn credit. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Hannah or Deb, and hopefully they can help you if you're having any problems with that quiz. But again, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and thank you for your feedback, and I appreciate you being here tonight. Have a good evening.